All right, it's 10:01 on Friday, February 11th. I don't know about the rest of you, but this month is going at about 100 miles an hour. Welcome and good morning. As you are joining us, please know that we record this for purposes of sharing good notes. So I'm going to ask our executive officer if there's any information, any announcements that the board may need or you wish to provide.
No, not this morning, Madam Vice President. All's in order.
Okay. Well, then I should introduce myself. I'm Jane Dolan. I'm the Vice President of the board. We do know that the president position has been vacant since January 1st, so I'll conduct the meetings as the Vice President. So welcome to you all, and I'm going to ask Ryan if he would do a roll call so we do know board members who are here. Mr. Jones?
Board Member Grego.
Good morning, yes.
Board Member Johnson.
I'm here. Good morning, everybody.
Board Member Ramirez. Board Member Valines.
Here. Good morning.
Board Member Countryman.
Present. Good morning, all.
Vice President Dolan.
I'm here. Did you ask for Board Member Grego and I missed it?
I did, yeah, at the beginning. And Board Member Ramirez has entered the meeting now, so.
Well, good morning, Mr. Ramirez. All right. Today is a workshop. The board is going to hear a presentation, first an introduction from Mr. Greg Harvey of our staff. And this presentation is to give us an overview of an analysis that is underway, not yet complete, for the modernization of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board designated floodway program. So today we'll receive a summary, some information, details that are being analyzed, and perhaps an indication of future recommendations. So are we ready to go? Mr. Harvey, call on you for the item introduction. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Vice President Dolan and members of the board. Today, we're going to hear a presentation on the effort to modernize our designated floodways. We've been working on a task order with GEI and HDR, namely Renato Espinoza, William Sickey, and Rod Mayer, to find out what it's going to take to modernize our outdated designated floodway boundaries. So I'm just going to give a quick introduction, go over a few items. I know Renato is going to run through the presentation and he's going to go in depth and has a lot of great material today. So some of the authorities of the board, California Water Code, Section 8609, the Sacramento and San Joaquin Rivers drainage designated floodways, declares the board may designate floodways throughout the Sacramento and San Joaquin Rivers drainage to control easements in and to preserve the flow regimens of floodways for the purpose of protecting public improvements, lives, land use values, and improvements created in reliance upon historical flooding patterns. So also within our California Code of Regulations, Title 23, Article 5, designated floodways, Sections 102 and 106. Section 102 is the considerations in designated floodways. And there's some components in there. And then also Article 5, Section 106, floodway modifications. So this one I was gonna read real briefly. If after the adoption of the designated floodway and floodway encroachment lines, the board determines that conditions have changed sufficiently to necessitate altering the lines, the board may, at any regularly noticed meeting, make modifications to the designated floodway as it deems to be appropriate. So those are some of our regulations that we have right now.
Great. Just a really quick question. Is there a difference between a designated floodway and the floodway between project levees? In other words, I've seen designated floodway maps, but as far as the flood system goes, is everything between the levees also designated floodway, or does that have a different connotation to it?
You know, this might be a question for Renato, but I don't think all areas between the levees you're speaking of are designated floodways, and sometimes they go outside of there as well.
Okay.
And I think it's going to be shown that some of the data and criteria used at the time made those lines, you know, not.
Okay, I'm just confused about it, but maybe as we go through the presentation, it'll become clear.
I think that there are many things about this that need to be updated, and Mr. Countryman, I think you're pointing out the information. Certainly what's between levees would be a river. But yes, it's clear after a lifetime for some of us, this is timely to look at it and bring it into the 21st century.
Yes, and as everyone may not know, the designated floodways were established at the end of the 60s and in the 70s and 80s. So it's been 40 plus years when they were established, and they were created with, as Renato will point out in more in depth, they were created with, you know, data that wasn't consistent. You know, return periods that were different, and aerial photography and different methods that made them not consistent, and that's one of the efforts we're trying to do. Also, we're trying to align with California's, you know, roadmap to a warmer and more extreme climate. So we're trying to align the new modifications to the 2018 Safeguarding California Plan, the 2020 Water Resiliency Portfolio, and most recently the 2021 progress report of that report. And also, of course, our Central Valley Flood Protection Plan and the update that's coming later this year. So we're trying to, you know, incorporate climate change into potential revisions or modifications that wasn't considered, you know, 40 plus years ago. So, like I said, Renato will go into more depth, but some of the reasons for modernizing the boundaries, different return periods, different studies, and like I said, you know, climate change wasn't incorporated, which is a huge factor now, as everybody knows. So just a few things to consider when you're listening to this presentation. You know, do all of our designated floodways need to be updated? Maybe some areas don't. And, you know, we'll see that over the years, you know, we've had many floods, many big floods that changes the direction of the streams and the rivers. And, you know, over 40 years, some of the rivers don't align with the old boundaries. So maybe those areas, you know, we focus on and try to modernize our boundaries and get the rivers within them. Also, you know, existing maps. What existing maps do we have or studies that are already out there that we could potentially use so we don't have to reinvent the wheel? You know, there's some FEMA maps out there that Renato will go over, and the differences between, you know, our boundaries and the FEMA maps and why they were created. And, you know, maybe the whole system doesn't have FEMA maps, for instance. And so but areas that they do, maybe we could utilize that information. And then also something to consider, you know, should we update our standards? So on how we establish the boundaries. So, you know, instead of using a return period of 50 years in one area and a return storm of 150 years in another area, you know, we set criteria to make them all consistent. So just some things to consider when you're listening to the presentation today. So with that, I will let Renato Espinoza take over. So if there are any questions for me before we get going, I'd be happy to answer those.
Mr. Harvey, this is James Dillon. At some point, will you indicate some kind of schedule as to milestones and completion?
Can you repeat that? Vice President, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Well, let me turn this volume up. At some point, will you or the consultants indicate some schedule of milestones and or completion of this report?
Yes, we can definitely do that. And we have some milestones right now, and we can provide that after this. That's no problem.
Okay, thank you. We're ready to go then? We call Mr. Torres first.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, Vice President Dolan, members of the board, good morning. My name is Renato Espinosa. I work for HDR Engineering, and as Greg mentioned, we've been performing a study and analysis to assess the designated floodways and then strategize on how to go about modernizing them. So today I'm going to provide an update on the work that we've done and the work that we're planning to do. Can we go to the next slide, please? Here's a brief overview of the information we're going to be presenting on. We'll be providing some background and some context. We're going to provide an update on our current findings and then considerations that we are evaluating and for the process of modernizing designated floodways. And we will provide a couple of sample pilot reaches or candidates for pilot reaches and some of the things we're considering as we're prioritizing designated floodways that may need modernization. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this presentation is to present findings from the designated floodway review that we have been performing, working alongside board staff. We're also going to provide an overview of the considerations that we are evaluating in modernizing designated floodways. Again, we're going to provide a couple of candidate examples for pilot reaches. And just this presentation, the purpose is to provide information to the board and to the public and get feedback so we can consider this input as we move forward. This figure that we have here on the right is actually just a screenshot of the best available maps that are presented in DWR's website, and you can actually, there's a link to it through the board's website, but this is the information that the public sees when one wants to go in and look at the current delineations of designated floodways. Next slide, please. So I'll jump into the background. First of all, and I think this might answer the question you just had, board member Countryman. So the definition of a designated floodway, there are two. One, it's the channel of the stream and that portion of the adjoining floodplain reasonably required to provide for the passage of a design flood, as indicated by floodway encroachment lines on an adopted map. That's what we're seeing here on the right. Those are those pink polygons that we see along the Central Valley. Those are all the designated floodways that are delineated. But there is another definition, the floodway between existing levees as adopted by the board or the legislature. So they are floodways, but they're not delineated designated floodways. There is approximately 1,300 miles of streams with designated floodways in California. That number, because of how you might want to count the miles of streams, if they're split channels, meandering, and so on, if you were to perform a GIS accounting of the miles, it's actually closer to 1,800 miles. Again, that's if you're counting the same stream, but with multiple channels and so on. Next slide, please. So here are a couple of helpful considerations that the board needs in order to designate floodways. So first of all, the board designates floodways for the purpose of protecting public improvements, lives, land use values, and improvements created in reliance upon historical flooding patterns. That is a section from the Water Code, and additional considerations are provided in the California Code of Regulations, Title 23. Article 5, there's Section 102 and Section 106. Greg touched on these a little bit, but I do want to highlight a few items. For example, in Section 102, the Code of Regulations tells us that existing and projected federal, state, and local flood control improvements and regulations affecting the floodplain, the degree of danger from flooding to life, property, public health, and welfare, and the rate and type of development taking place upon the floodplain should all be considered in designating and updating floodways. So we are looking at things like the rate and type of development. If there's a designated floodway which is experiencing a lot of development, there are a lot of permits being requested along that designated floodway. These are things we're taking into consideration as required by the Code of Regulations. Next slide, please. Here's an area, if we look at the picture on the right, here's an area near Bakersfield along the Kern River. The picture on the top is what it used to look like in 1994. The picture in the bottom that's an aerial imagery from 2020, same location. So we see that there are locations where the designated floodways in these screenshots shown by the blue area, where there's significant development happening right adjacent to designated floodway boundaries. So we're looking at this information, we're looking at development growing and encroaching into designated floodways to understand what designated floodways may need to be prioritized in order to, for more modernization. Because this development is based on outdated designated floodway boundaries, and this could potentially increase hazards to life and property. If a particular entity, a county, a city is looking at the designated floodway boundaries and considering that in how they permit development or other encroachments, we really need to take a look at these designated floodway boundaries and make sure that they are accurately capturing flood hazards. Other things we're taking a look at is climate change. So when these designated floodways were originally delineated, there was a different frame of thought. Hydrology was thought of to be more static. So we looked back at historical flood records and developed projections based on those. But now we know that our climate is changing. There will be more intense rainfall events, and this coupled with faster melting snowpacks will increase flood hazards. So looking at the past is not sufficient to be able to project what future flood hazards may look like. Next slide. We're also taking into consideration vulnerable population and disadvantaged communities. This is, consistent with state initiatives that ask us to do so in taking government actions. Many of our Central Valley communities are disadvantaged and at risk due to inadequate flood protection. So this is something that we're considering. We're also looking at riparian habitat preservation and restoration. So we know that for the state of California, stream restoration projects are important. We're trying to increase the amount of habitat we have along our streams. But these projects have the potential to impact water surface elevations. So having updated hydraulic models and better information about the real flood hazards along these streams can help facilitate restoration projects without increasing flood hazards. Also, per the regulations, we're looking into flood improvement projects. So the current delineations for designated floodways, they were started as far back as 50 years ago, all the way to like 30 years ago. So they're old. So they haven't considered all the flood improvement projects that have happened since then, or that are currently planned. And these have the potential to impact the extent of designated floodways. Next slide, please. So now I'm gonna jump over a little bit to talk a little bit about FEMA. So when the designated floodway program started, FEMA flood hazard data was not widely available. The program started roughly around the same time, actually. The National Flood Insurance Act was set in place, I believe 1968, right around the time that the state started the designated floodway program. So as these designated floodways were being delineated, there weren't a lot of already established special flood hazard areas that FEMA had developed, so they were kind of going in parallel. But there is a lot more FEMA data now, and so we are considering FEMA data that is available, that is relevant, and we will leverage what we can, what makes sense, in order to make the designated floodway modernization more effective, more efficient. But we need to consider the differences. So there are differences between a FEMA special flood hazard area and a designated floodway. And I'm going to list a few of them right here. So the purpose of the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, is to provide flood insurance for recovery. That's the main purpose of the NFIP is flood insurance. FEMA allows structures for human habitation in their special flood hazard areas, where board regulations do not allow structures for human habitation. FEMA special flood hazard areas are based on back-looking hydrology, as were or are the current designated floodway delineations, but we know that the state of California is looking to incorporate what we know about climate change in all our current efforts to mitigate flood hazards. So there may be differences there about what we can leverage from FEMA information. FEMA is also focused on urban areas, largely focused on urban areas, so not all designated floodways are covered. On the right, we can see both the FEMA flood hazard areas and the designated floodway coverage. And we see the designated floodway coverage is represented by the pink polygons, and FEMA special flood hazard areas, particularly AE, AH, and AAO zones. So these are the areas that are going to have detailed information, and they're not just approximate studies. Those are shown in blue, and we see that there's actually there are a lot of gaps between the two data sets. So one covers what the other one doesn't cover in large sense. There is some overlap, and where there is overlap, if there are hydraulic models available from FEMA and those are relatively recent, we may be able to leverage those to move forward. But as I alluded to just a second ago, a lot of the special flood hazard areas that FEMA has in their maps right now, they were also developed with approximate methods, and a lot of them are updated, 20, 30 years old as well. So it's not like FEMA has a lot of fresh available studies that we can leverage, but whatever they do have that is applicable, we will. Next slide, please. Okay, Greg, I think he introduced also some of the state documents, policy documents that we are considering taking into account as we develop a strategy for designated floodway modernization. One of them is the Water Resiliency Portfolio, and this came about from Executive Order N1019. And there are some policies stated in the water resiliency portfolio that are directly applicable to a designated floodway modernization program. One of them being embrace innovation and new technologies. And we really need to go back and look at what data is available compared to what tools are available now. And it's just a huge gap. So we have a lot of new technologies, different resources now that we can and will capitalize on for a modern designated floodway program. Other proposals stated in the water resiliency portfolio for state agencies to support supply diversification include to modernize water data systems to inform real water management decisions and also long-term planning, which is very applicable to the designated floodway program, which is a tool for long-term planning. And then also to help regions prepare for new flood patterns. And that's precisely what we're trying to do here. Next slide, please. Okay, so we also reviewed the Safeguarding California plan and looked at where there's information and policies that we need to have in mind as we move forward with a designated floodway modernization effort. Principle number 1 in the Safeguarding California plan is to consider climate change in all government actions. So as we're considering flood hazards, potential flooding extents in the Central Valley, we have to consider climate change. The Safeguarding California plan is broken up into several different sections for different types of resources that may be impacted by climate change. For example, energy being a different one, but water is one of them. And the first policy laid out for water is to vigorously prepare California for flooding, which directly relates to the effort that we're undertaking here. The plan does list 2 ongoing actions that the Central Valley Flood Protection Board is currently engaged in. One of them being the update to the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan and how it's incorporating climate change into that. And a second one is the flood investment strategy. Another water policy in the Safeguarding California plan that directly relates to our ongoing efforts is water policy number 6, which asks state agencies to address water-related impacts of climate change on vulnerable and disadvantaged populations and cultural resources. So that's definitely one of the different perspectives that we are looking at this issue from. Next slide, please. Okay, this kind of wraps up the setting of where the information that we had readily available to us. This table here shows the details that were available about the existing designated floodway delineations. When we started this assessment, this analysis, we had the designated floodway boundaries themselves, the regulations, and this table. And this table provides some useful information about the designated floodways. It tells us basically all the data that's available. We can go to the next slide, please. This actually, the next slide actually has a more readable list of the type of information that's provided in that table. So it lists the designated floodways, all of them by stream. It provides the design flow that was considered in delineating the designated floodway, the average frequency that was used, and then the methods that were used to develop those delineations, and an adequacy rating. So the adequacy rating is basically at the time that the current designated floodways were developed or reviewed, this adequacy rating wasn't assigned by us. This is something that the designated floodways are already assigned based on the way that they were developed. As was mentioned earlier, some of them were developed using hydraulic analysis, but others were developed with limited information, such as photographic evidence, flood photography, and maybe some of that flood photography was less than the design flow. And then also observed high water marks, topography, things like that at the time it was the best available information at these locations. So the different designated floodways have a assigned adequacy rating that ranks from 1 to 10, 10 being the best, to 1 being the worst. And in order to be assigned a rating of 10, it had to be a detailed study that they were able to verify with field information. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into kind of what we found as we actually dug into the details of the designated floodway delineations. In general, we found that they are limited because of their age and changing conditions. The program started in 1969. Most delineations were developed in the 1970s and 1980s. As we can see here in that image on the top right, that's the same section of the Sacramento River. The image on the far right is 1985. We can see that the main channel of the stream is contained by the designated floodway boundaries. And in 2021, the channel has migrated, and now it's not contained by the designated floodway boundary. So this designated floodway boundary is not actually capturing where our floodway truly is. We also found that they were developed, that the designated floodway delineations were developed using inconsistent criteria. And this goes back to that table that we were just showing. There was more data available for some streams than for others. So at the time, they used the best data available. The design floods used range from 10 years for some streams to 150 years for, I think, one stream. Most of them were in the range of 50 and 100 years, but there are about 10 streams that use a much lower frequency. Actually, I think I provide a summary of how many streams exactly in subsequent slides. But in general, there was different criteria and different methodologies used to define the boundaries. So what that means is that streams are not all regulated to the same standard, and this leaves some encroachments with greater exposure. Also, this is interesting, particularly when we're thinking of things in the context of FEMA. So some designated floodways that were analyzed hydraulically used the squeeze method or the floodway analysis method. That image on the bottom right shows a cross-section of a stream. And if one was to just use a hydraulic model to simulate a 100-year flood and map the boundary of the resulting boundary, you would get a floodplain that extends as wide as that green line on top that says 100-year floodplain. The floodway analysis, what that is within the hydraulic model now, you go in and you hypothetically simulate encroachments. So you actually reduce the cross-sectional area by squeezing it until you get a surcharge of a certain magnitude. Typically, FEMA uses 1 foot. This was done for 10 streams that currently have designated floodway delineations, but some of them used a 1/2 foot surcharge, some of them used a 1 foot surcharge. And again, so the way that delineated designated floodways are presented is not consistent. Some of them have this squeeze, some of them don't. And then the floodway fringe, which is represented by that brown line, is not noted in any of the maps. So we don't know what the true extent of that design flood is. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just kind of a summary by the numbers of how many different types of designated floodways we have. So there are 21 designated floodways which use a design flood more common than 100 years. So that means they use either a 50-year, a 10-year, they're all over the place from 10 years to 25, 40, 50 years, but they're more frequent than a 100-year flood event. There are 52 that use a design flow of 100 years or rarer. Most of them are 100-year. I think there are 1 or maybe 2 that use 150 years. 10 of the designated floodway boundaries were developed using a floodway analysis or a squeeze method. And of the total number of designated floodways, I believe it's 73, 39 of them have a adequacy rating of 7 or greater, between 7 and 10. 24 of them have an adequacy rating of 4 to 6, I apologize. And then 11 of them have an adequacy rating less than 3. So even at the time those 11 designated floodways were delineated, the engineers doing that work recognized that they had limited information. They didn't have enough information to adequately represent the floodway for those particular streams. And 24 of them, it was, mediocre at best. But things have changed in the last 30 to 50 years since these designated floodways were delineated. So I would believe that if we go back and look at some of these, even some of the ones that had an adequacy rating of 7 or better, they might now actually have a lower adequacy rating because of changing conditions, as we saw along the Sacramento River. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's some additional findings, from the review of the existing designated floodways. So the tools or models used for the development of the current designated floodways are no longer, or they're not available for us to verify the boundaries or to assess impacts of encroachments. There are no models that can be used to reproduce the current boundaries. The alignment of some of the streams has changed through natural processes, causing designated floodway boundaries to no longer be accurate, and some, as seen in these images on the right, are visibly inadequate. The image on the top is from 1985. The image on the bottom is from 2018. We see that in 85, this channel was contained within the designated floodway boundary, which is represented by the yellow line. In 2018, the channel goes outside of the designated floodway boundary. And the current designated floodways are based on past hydrology and don't consider future flood magnitude projections or climate change. And many designated floodways with boundaries different from other regulatory flood data exist. So when we compare designated floodways that overlap with FEMA special flood hazard areas, most of them are very different. And this may be due to the fact that they have different intents, were developed with different methodologies, but this can create confusion to the public when they're trying to assess flood hazards in a particular area along a floodway. And not having the models or the data that was used to develop the current designated floodways, it's tough to be able to justify the current boundaries. Next slide, please. Okay, we also reviewed what data is available that we can leverage to update designated floodways if needed. We focused on basin-wide studies like CVFED, CVHS, CVFPB, and FEMA data, That's the Central Valley Floodplain Evaluation and Delineation Program that DWR developed a lot of hydraulic models. The Central Valley Hydrology Study that produced flows of different frequencies for the Central Valley streams. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, which also provides models and flows. And we identified overlaps and gaps between the existing designated floodways and the data that's available, so we can know how much we can leverage. And I'm just going to provide some highlights of the data that's provided in these tables here. But for example, we see that only for 11% of the total designated floodways are completely covered by a FEMA special flood hazard area, where 34 designated floodways do not have any coverage. They don't overlap at all with FEMA special flood hazard areas. There are 31 that have partial overlap, but that just may be a small segment, you know, and again, this is where we see those differences. Let's see, I also want to highlight that there is approximately 29% of coverage of CVFPB models of the designated floodways. So about 21 designated floodways, there are already hydraulic models ready to go. You know, if the board wants to go in there and assess the new flood hazards, these models do not have to be built from scratch. They could be adapted based on a set of criteria that's adopted for modernizing designated floodways, and the flood hazards can be assessed. About 12 of them have partial coverage, but there are 40 of them that have no coverage, and so other types of data, maybe hydraulic models for different studies, need to be evaluated to see if they're available, or they may need data to be created from scratch. Also, one of the items I'm going to highlight from the table below is that of the roughly 1,800 miles of designated floodways, you know, somewhere between 1,300 and 1,800, depending on how you cut it, there's only about 460 miles that overlap with FEMA data. So there is a large number of designated floodways that are providing a service by providing information to the public about the flood hazards in areas that FEMA does not provide any such information. Next slide, please. Okay. So we looked at the data that's available to leverage, but even then, we can't go in and modernize all the designated floodways at once. It is going to be a very you know, large effort to go and do this. So we also developed some criteria on how to assess the validity, the adequacy of the current designated floodway boundaries. We can look at the terrain or aerial imagery reflecting current conditions and compare it to the designated floodway boundaries now, as we can see in this image on the right, and assess, is this designated floodway still applicable? You see that the stream channel here meanders outside of the designated floodway. We can look at the design flows that were used and compare them to current understandings of hydrology for that particular stream and see if those are still relevant. We're looking at the rate of development around a particular stream, or if there are already you know, large developments adjacent to a stream. So there may be a particular designated floodway that's out in the middle of nowhere, and it's not really creating a flood hazard for a large section of the public or, you know, investments. And so those might not be as urgent to update as something that is right adjacent to a community, and it's not adequately capturing the flood hazards there. Next slide, please. We're looking at the original rating of the designated floodway. So if even at the time it was originally delineated, it was given a low rating, then we know that there isn't much confidence in the methodology that was used to develop the current delineation. Looking at existing and planned flood control projects that could potentially impact the extent of a designated floodway. Looking at data availability, hydraulic models, hydrology. So if a particular designated floodway, is in bad shape, they no longer capture the main channel, and it's adjacent to a community, and there are already models and hydrology, that one's going to rise to the top of the list. And so based on this criteria and availability of resources, we can identify which designated floodways we can revise relatively quicker than others that may not have data available to them. And as we assess the designated floodways using this criteria, we may find that some of them may not need revisions. So that's something to note as well. Next slide, please. Okay. And so I mentioned that some of these designated floodways already have models available to them. I believe this is the San Joaquin River on the right, and what we are seeing there, that blue line, that's the stream center line. The green lines, those are cross sections from the CVFPB models. And so, for example, here we already have a hydraulic model that can be used to hydraulically simulate a flood through this stream. But what we want to avoid is going back to what was done in the past, where different streams were and different designated floodways were delineating using a wide array of criteria that's inconsistent between each other. And so what we're doing is we're developing a set of standards for hydrology, such as frequency of flooding, upstream levee performance. If there's a large flood, our upstream levee is going to contain that flood. Is it going to get down to that particular stream that you're analyzing? Most of these streams are regulated by reservoirs. So what are the reservoir operations that are being considered in analyzing these streams? And climate change. So we're establishing standards or proposed standards for all these different topics. Another one is hydraulics. A lot of these streams can be modeled using a 1D hydraulic model like FEMA does. Most of their models are their streams or special flood hazard areas are developed using a one-dimensional model. But as you can see, this one right here, this the San Joaquin River, having such a wide floodplain and a meandering channel, and during high flows, there's water going to be going in a bunch of different directions. It may be necessary to really capture the flood hazards here and understand velocities and depths and so on to use a two-dimensional model. And luckily, California has developed a lot of these through some of the programs that we mentioned earlier, including the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. And to convey this to the public, we also need to establish some mapping standards, just for accuracy and ease of use. Next slide, please. Okay, so just reiterating that we are leveraging existing tools. This image on the right is just showing a two-dimensional hydraulic model that I developed for a different region, but just showing how these types of tools, if leveraged adequately, they can make this effort significantly more efficient and have greater accuracy. So these tools are available to us now. They weren't available before, and so we are categorizing which tools and data we have available to us to perform this effort as best and most effectively as we can. State flood modeling tools cover approximately 50% of designated floodways, and we still haven't even looked at, known H&H consultants or other potential sources where we might be able to find existing models that can be adapted using the criteria that we described earlier so that we're not starting from scratch. And we will, if applicable, leverage FEMA data and potentially even partnerships. FEMA has a cooperating technical partner program that provides funding for these types of studies. But in order to do that, the community has to adopt the resulting floodplain or special flood hazard area as part of the NFIP. And it does have to follow FEMA standards and FEMA criteria. So if we want to do this, we may have to adopt standards strategically so they don't necessarily conflict, but that they go above and beyond what FEMA does, because ultimately, you know, that's what we're trying to do. That this information doesn't just provide flood hazards for the purpose of flood insurance, but rather for the objectives and the strategic goals of California. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of benefits that come about from revising designated floodways and having these updated tools and information. Namely, I mean, you can have a significant reduction in flood hazards, better inform the public of flood hazards. This information will serve as a non-structural measure to advance strategic objectives, and also can be used by public proponents to use the new maps and models to efficiently and cost-effectively design projects with minimum impacts to floodways, including restoration projects, proposed encroachments, and so on. Next slide, please. These tools, this new information can help the Central Valley Flood Protection Board issue or deny permits with a better understanding of potential impacts and benefits of proposed encroachments. It will accommodate for environmental improvements without increasing flood risk. And then, you know, a point I just want to make is non-structural approaches are better for the environment and cost far less than structural projects required to protect development along streams by preventing risky development. And I just want to use this example on the right. We have that development that's right in the middle of that floodway. And if we look at current projections, hydrologic projections along this stream, you know, there's going to be some flow through that area. It might be shallow flooding, but to be able to inform the public about this, these potential flood hazards is important. Next slide. Okay. Some last considerations for, you know, just to kind of wrap up the presentation before we just show a few examples of streams that are candidates for pilot analysis. We are developing a public and stakeholder engagement plan to have regular engagement. We want to get input from stakeholders and local entities, counties, cities. What are their needs? What are their challenges, so we can help address those as best as we can. We're seeking a programmatic approach for this. There's going to have to be a strategy developed to address items such as CEQA. And then also, you know, not after updating designated floodways, put them on a shelf and then just kind of let them get old again, you know, and become inadequate, but establish some sort of periodic evaluation approach so that they can be updated with changing conditions. After a big flood, they can be reevaluated to see if the channel migrated and the designated floodway is still applicable. We know our streams like to move. So this is an opportunity to baseline the designated floodways and develop new tools that can be used in the future as well. Next slide. Okay, here are just a couple of potential pilot reaches. Our task order that we're currently working on, it involves reviewing the designated floodways, assessing them for you know, the need to be updated, developing some standards and strategy, just kind of the points that we highlighted right now. But we're also going to do a couple of pilot reaches where we're going to analyze them with new hydrology, new hydraulics, compare them against the old designated floodway, you know, just as a proof of concept. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here are a couple, there are many others that we're also reviewing and considering as the pilot reaches. Next slide, please. This is the Sacramento River. This is one that we've seen a couple times in this presentation. For this particular channel, it's shifted. It's no longer within the designated floodway, so that's a huge red flag there that this particular designated floodway needs to be updated. In this part of the Sacramento River, the design flow that was used at the time was approximately 180 CFS, and it's listed as a 50-year flood event, where more recent estimates of peak flow there for a 100-year event are actually lower in the range of 155 to 160,000 CFS. Interestingly enough, for this specific reach, FEMA has 245,000 as the 100-year flow. So that's something we should evaluate and feel more comfortable that we're adequately characterizing the hydrology in this location. Next slide. There are approximately 11 regional flood management projects going on in the vicinity, and they're you know, that's something that we need to evaluate if these projects have the potential to impact the boundaries of the designated floodway. This reach does go along a developed and developing urban area, namely Red Bluff here, but there are other communities along the Central Valley next to the Sacramento, this reach of the Sacramento River that could potentially be impacted from flooding from this stream. There are currently there were two encroachment permits requested in the last 5 years and 2 additional ones in the last 10 years. But one of the things that we also became aware of in this assessment is that there's like over 7,000 different encroachment, unpermitted encroachments. So that's something that if we identify it, we will take into consideration as we select pilot reaches or we prioritize them for modernization. Next slide, please. This stream does have hydrologic data available both from the CVHS and CVFPB. There are hydraulic models with complete coverage both from CVFED and CVFPB. And even at the time this designated floodway was first developed, it was assigned an adequacy rating of 1. So it was developed using approximate methods based on historical observations. Next slide, please. We're going to talk a little bit about Cache Creek, just another stream as an example. This one, we can see as well that the channel now meanders in and out of the designated floodway boundaries. For this one, it's the opposite. The design flows in this location were in the range of 40,000 CFS. New estimates are closer to 60,000 CFS if we look at the Central Valley Hydrology Study. So this is one that if we look at current hydrology estimates and the new alignment of the channel, we would anticipate to see a significantly different designated floodway boundary. Next slide, please. Okay, there's only one project here, flood management project in this area, and it's mostly covered by existing information. Let me see. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so we have hydrology for this stream, and this is one of those examples where the stream, let's say that's about 15 miles of stream, about 14 of them are covered by existing hydraulic information. So we would have to develop new hydraulic data for about 1 mile at the very upstream end. And at the time, this particular designated floodway was also given a low adequacy rating of 5. These are, again, just a couple of examples of streams that we're considering for a pilot analysis. These are just examples, but this is typical of what we're seeing with a lot of streams. Some of them, it may be the hydrology, the topography that's changing, but we're seeing that, yes, most of these designated floodways need some attention. So with that, I'm going to go to the next slide. I think that's the end of the presentation. We'll open it up for questions.
Wow, thank you. We have also received this PowerPoint, so it'll be something to analyze and as we see. So let me ask first, are there any board members? I don't see any hands raised, so let me ask if there are board members who have some input, questions, comments. I don't hear any. See no hands.
I have some points to discuss.
Well, go right ahead, Mr. Countryman. I'm not surprised.
Okay. The examples you presented all of them did not have levees. Are you proposing to review the reaches where levees exist?
No, that's a very good question, Board Member Countryman. Actually, most of the delineated designated floodways are outside of reaches that have levees, because most of the reaches that have levees, you don't really need a delineation. You know that the extents of the floodway are between one levee and the next levee.
Okay, so in your prioritization, what I hear you saying is that if there's levees, it would have a low priority for revisiting it. Is that correct?
No, what I'm saying is most of the designated floodways that have levees don't have a delineation. They're not delineated. It's just assumed that the floodway is between the levees, so it's like our areas of state plan of flood control. Rod Mayer is also on the line here. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say, Rod, to kind of characterize what I'm trying to say.
So I think I agree with Joe's point that if there are levees, that it would be a very low priority because you already have the boundaries of the floodway set. And there are, as I recall, a few situations where the designated floodway is in a levied section.
Yeah,
as Renato was saying, mostly that's not the case.
Yeah, we should note that, though, that looking at levees as a criteria.
So as far as the public safety and development situation, though, if levees provide less than 100-year protection, fragility, and I don't even know if 100 years is the right thing. I think currently state policy is 200 years for development. We're leaving a tremendous amount of area uncovered because if the levee fails, there's going to be a lot of flooding. And if the fragility of the levee is bad, it's likely that it will flood at the 100-year or less level. So that might be, I'm not sure, as far as the public safety, I mean, it's extremely controversial. I'm not saying we should do it, but I'm just pointing that out.
Yep.
So if we're not doing levee, I had a question too. The second point is exceedance frequency versus design flood. With the climate change and everything, the frequency methodology is, I think, obsolete, frankly. Because you don't have a continuous record to base the frequency analysis on. So, and we do have a big problem in our system with the core design flood, the so-called 57 profiles that have been changed, with new projects that we've constructed. So again, if you're not doing levee reaches, you won't really go into that. But I feel like that needs to be updated, what those design flows are and, what the freeboard is and whatever. These are just comments. You don't need to respond to them.
It's a very good point, though.
Yeah, there's a lot of updating and lots of programs. So I see that Mr. Ramirez and then Mr. Reinhardt, but did someone want to respond to Mr. Councilman further?
I just wanted to mention that last comment you had, Board Member Countryman. Yeah, that's a very valid point. And so we're definitely going to think of, have to evaluate points like that as we're developing the criteria for modernizing the designated floodways.
Okay. My third point is, you said you're going to do a lot of coordination, which I think is really going to be needed. Because this thing works best if it's from the bottom up rather than the top down. And so I think coordination with our state floodplain management and the local county floodplain management, as far as setting priorities and needs, I think would be very, very important in this. Although my fourth point, you mentioned climate change several times. I'm not sure how that's going to work into this, where there's design flows and things are set up, and FEMA definitely doesn't use climate change in their mapping. So we'll need a strategy for how and what the climate change, how that will be used, because in the end, there's going to be management or regulations of these floodplains required by the state, required by the local agencies, or who, as far as what development or what elevation of structures would be required. And of course, one of the sore points that the state of California has with the FEMA program is in ag areas where you can't even build a barn, which has a low impact to, public safety, because of what the FEMA regulations are. So hopefully we're not going to somehow be supporting that concept. And you already mentioned prioritization. I think that's good. How are you, like you said, there's 7,000 encroachments, unpermitted encroachments. How are the state going to regulate this thing? That's a lot of land and a lot of encroachments. Is that going to be part of your analysis of evaluation of how to manage that process?
We're definitely going to provide information that's going to help inform, the board and board staff on how to manage that. And we can provide recommendations as to how that might be tackled, or at least identified encroachments that are, causing a significant flood hazard. But that's definitely something more that would be more appropriate for the board or board staff to address how they might want to manage that in the future. But we will generate information and recommendations on how that might be approached.
Thank you. That's all the comments I have.
All right, thank you. Mr. Ramirez, you're up next.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks, Joe. I just have a couple of thoughts to share, and I wanted to first thank the folks that pulled this together and the information, and also our staff for putting a little dent in this. This is a mountain of work, right? Moving forward, just a lot of things that need to be done, a lot of complexity. And as much as we're trying to approach it, I think programmatically, we all know, like Joe said, this is really specific and unique, almost always to each area. That said, I'm really excited about this. I think it's an opportunity, and I think it's an opportunity for a couple of reasons. One, I think we can be in the position of trying to not provide another layer of regulatory restrictions, but maybe to connect all the things that are out there already that we know about, right? There's local hazard mitigation plans, there's FEMA requirements. This program already is a regulatory requirement, right? It's just old. So we're not trying to create something that is new and throw another wrench into it. But I think because it is old, as we strive to update it, we can do that in a way that really helps the people on the ground get information that they need, right? Like if you're a local city, county person and you're working on a bridge or another utility facility and you want to know where you should build it, right now you look at a lot of different things and they're probably inconsistent, which isn't really helpful. And this program could be a way to try to connect those things so that there is some consistency, and they don't need to always match, like somebody said, but at least we'll know why they don't, if they don't, and people will have information upon which they can then make a decision. And I think the floodway program, could also include all the things we talked about as drivers on our end: climate change, equity, disadvantaged communities, restoration. The federal program is the federal program. It has its own drivers. I don't know that we, like Joe said, want to defer to that or have them all apply in the state's effort. And I think there's a way maybe to try to talk about how they're related, but then this is going to be maybe the place that you can see how the value is added, but also see how everything is connected so that people can make improvements and provide a greater buffer and reduce flood risk, and also provide some more space for recreation and for people in these communities along these river corridors. And it's hard, right? The rivers move back and forth, and there's no levees, and so it's hard to put a line on a map if we know things are going to keep changing. It's a bit of a challenge, but I think it's a worthy effort. And my second point about why I think this is an opportunity is that what's on the books now is just old and often wrong. And we spend a lot of time, the staff spend time analyzing projects, sometimes restoration projects, as encroachments. And in the meanwhile, on the same river, somebody builds a house inside the floodway line and we don't do anything. Nobody tells us, maybe they don't know to ask. But we're spending time trying to protect these corridors, but it's not really comprehensive in the way that it needs to be if we're really going to reduce risk and protect these communities better. I think we have an obligation to try to update these things and to make it better, and also give people on the ground better information that they can then use. So again, I'm really excited about this, and I'm really grateful for taking the approach that you guys have, looking at all the things out there, and then recognizing that we need to sort of approach these things, site by site, case by case. But having this as an introduction and a place to start and acknowledging both the shortcomings and some of the opportunities, I think is a good start. So thank you for doing it that way.
Thank you. I was going to say that as well, Mr. Mayor. It's an example of the importance of recording some of this. So that was great. Mr. Reinhardt, you had your hand up and then it went down. Did you want to put it up again?
Oh, I took it down because you had me in the queue. Thank you, Vice President Dolan. Rick Reinhardt with MBK Engineers, commenting on behalf of the California Central Valley Flood Control Association. I also want to thank staff and the consultant team for bringing this forward. This is a long overdue update. I've been working on permits and issues in the designated floodway for a while now, and the hydrology, the boundaries, the permitting requirements have at times been frustrating. I do want to make a couple of points. I have circulated Renato's memo to the membership, and I've talked to a couple of members. So a couple of points I want to make now as you consider what you do going forward is first the issue of the flows. There's a lot of talk about including climate change and what flow to use, but Joe made an important point, and that's the Sacramento River Flood Control Project has design flows. And I think that's a starting point for the conversation. Is that the right flows to use for the designated floodway? And if so, then climate change really isn't a factor because we have an authorized flow that we're using. I also want to point out that the majority of the land, the vast majority of the land in these areas is privately held. And in making this designation, you're not providing those property owners compensation with the restrictions that are come with being in the designated floodway. And so I think you should proceed with caution when talking about land use. That in my opinion, that's really outside the board's purview in terms of development related items. That's why we have SB 5 and the requirements of making a ULOP finding for development in urban areas and the 100-year standard for the rural areas. But most importantly, most of these lands are in agriculture, and we don't want an onerous process on those agricultural activities. Agriculture is the best use of the floodplain, in my opinion, and we want to encourage that agriculture to continue to thrive in these floodplains. So to that end, I'd encourage you to think about coming up with a simplified permitting process for the designated floodways. I recently worked with board staff on a groundwater recharge program for a project for the Consumnes, and it was quite a bit of effort to go through the permitting process for something that pretty clearly had very little above ground features, very little impact on the system. And so maybe coming up with some type of permit process where if it affects less than 1% of the floodplain, kind of like we do in the levied reaches, that maybe there's just a notification, something that goes on file acknowledging it, a small permit fee, but not an onerous process for the property owners to go through. So we look forward to engaging with board staff and the board as you go through the process for update this. And once again, want to thank you for a long overdue update. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. I would like to hear more. I have a couple of comments, but I'd like to hear more about what you think in terms of next steps for the work that's that's part of this project that you're in contract for, and if that's Greg or you, Renato. I'm also commenting wise. I'm co-sign what Tim said about the importance of this. I'd also like to hear more, now or in next updates about, where you think we can rely on other existing maps and models and not be reinventing something. I was intrigued by the comment that, we have not exact overlap between different models and maps, and sometimes that makes sense because they have different purposes, but it can also be confusing to folks. And so it seems like where there is conceptual purpose overlap, relying on those would be a good idea to reduce confusion and not have to reinvent a wheel. But that might get us part of the way in some of the places and not in other places, and hearing more from you about where that's likely to work and where something else will be needed would be good. And then as we turn to, beyond the maps to what do we do about it, would also definitely be interested in following up on Rick's comment. I had a very similar one about, needing to sort between the stuff that has strong implications for public safety and our high priorities, and not getting hung up or creating problems for people on stuff that isn't as much. And whether we're talking about general permits or something, or just a prioritization scheme, we want to be able to focus on the things that matter for safety and helping local governments plan development the way that they would and make good decisions, and not things that are low priority or even counterproductive because they're in the way of good activities.
Thank you. I see Mike Mirzwa has a hand up. No one else. Mr. Mirzwa.
Thank you. Oh, good. My camera is up. There are a couple things. I would like to thank the team for the presentation. I thought it was an excellent background. I had a lot of comments that are in the chat. I first want to convey that comments are hard sometimes in written. They might seem like they're negative. They're not. I'm really happy that we're having this discussion today, and I wanted to lead off with that. I think there's a lot of work that's been due, and I echo the sentiments of others. This is something that is well overdue. But I did want to also highlight some things from my work as the state floodplain manager and my work with FEMA, just to sort of kind of set the historical perspective of what's coming from the FEMA maps that are out there. It is true that there are a lot of gaps in the flood insurance rate maps that FEMA has. These are maps that were originally intended to delineate areas for mandatory flood insurance requirements. However, FEMA does have a number of other products that I want to talk about briefly out here, and they've been evolving and enhancing their capacity within the past 10 years to go through and identify things, including floodways. First, the process by which FEMA goes through and develops a flood insurance rate map is called a flood insurance study. The name is misleading. I don't like this being called a national flood insurance program because it does more than national flood insurance. I don't like the maps being called a flood insurance rate map because by practice across the United States, we use these maps for much more than just flood insurance. And the studies are much more than flood insurance. They really are also informing regulations in zoning and building activities that are adopted, as a board member Countryman had indicated, from a bottom-up process through locally adopted ordinances. FEMA used to have a product that was called a flood boundary and floodway map. They abbreviated FBFM. These maps are no longer provided, but these were specific services that FEMA would provide to go through and identify the floodways. Renato, you did an excellent job describing that process, so I definitely agree with that. FEMA has a newer service product that they're also incorporating now that they call base level engineering studies, where they're not going through and identifying floodways, or floodplains, but they are going through and characterizing elevations and depths within floodways in largely rural areas. So these are areas where they're trying to get out of these other activities, but they've been merging these products. The previous flood boundary and floodway maps are now incorporated into the newer firms. So a little history of what's been happening out there with the NFIP maps is they really didn't start really doing mapping because FEMA didn't exist until the late 1970s of going through and doing the mapping until the 1980s. Many of the maps that we were working with in the 90s and 2000s were based on those 1980 studies and maps. In the early 2000s, FEMA went through a process of digitizing the old maps, but not doing new modeling studies. It wasn't until the current 2010s, 2020s that you began to see FEMA actually developing sort of the next generation of maps that are out there. I put in the chat that within the Central Valley, FEMA is currently undergoing and doing maps for all of Fresno and Madera counties. So a portion of the area we're talking out here. So there will be an opportunity to work with them on those. Key parts of that process, FEMA will tell you that it takes about 5 years. Local floodplain managers will point out that it's about 7 years of engagement to start a mapping process to get to a final product, because FEMA has a very intensive engagement process where they propose the information, the data, the boundaries, work through the models, and eventually get buy-in from that local level on the map that can include a floodway in it. So I would definitely encourage us to be engaged in that process, but also be aware and caution that when you get into the engagement on these maps, you really want to have that buy-in, and that takes a lot of effort to go through and do. The second thing is on the enforcement. The National Flood Insurance Program, when a community adopts a FEMA floodway, which is different than what we're talking about here, there is an enforcement mechanism out there. It's called the Community Assistance Visit. The way that process works is each community that is participating in NFIP that has adopted a floodway ordinance, when they're on cycle once every 5 years, either FEMA or a representative under direction and training from FEMA, from the Department of Water Resources, conducts a community assistance visit, which is a week-long audit of the enforcement actions that community has taken to follow their own regulations. And then based off of any deficiencies in that, FEMA and the Department of Water Resources work with that community over the course of a year to rectify any sort of gaps that might have occurred out there. So I just wanted to caution that there's a lot of work on the back end for going through and doing this. And what is successful in delegating this down at the local level is that you have this larger army or body of people who can do the work in a smaller group that can come up and catch up on the audits. One of the last things I want to bring up is when talking to floodplain managers, and I was at a conference yesterday at UC Berkeley with Jerry Galway, who some of you will remember. We were talking about a couple of things, and one of the things is an idea that I've had is when we come up with maps, we should be tagging them on a 2 matrix level, and I really appreciate the thought into the prioritization that the group has, and that is on the quality of information to get the data on the map, and then a quality or level of information on the exposure. And one of the things Jerry Galway and I were talking about was the Army Corps of Engineers does have a levee safety advisory rating. They call it an LSAC. It's based off of what they have for their dam safety, the DSAC ratings, and it's an exposure analysis. So that definitely is something I see that this team is doing. But I think even the quality of data is important, or using more modern data. I've incorporated updated LiDAR, et cetera. So I think there's an opportunity to work on that. But the biggest thing is when we have these maps, we have to really talk about what the label and purpose is to avoid confusion, because ultimately a local floodplain manager, and this is something we came up with an experience from Santa Barbara County, their floodplain manager, is if there's too many maps out there, it's really hard for that floodplain manager to explain to their county board of supervisors which map is used for what circumstance. So sometimes there's a hesitation at the local level to have too many competing products. So thank you for my comments. I really do appreciate the work. And, I will commit my team to, assisting where we can, both in working with FEMA and providing whatever data we have out there and sort of our expertise in working with the local agencies. Over.
Thank you. I see no other hands raised, so let me ask, is there anyone else who wants to turn on their unmute themselves and make a comment or ask a question? Nice to see that you're here, Betty Andrews. Okay, then I will go back to Mr. last name wrong, Renato. Do you have any closing comments, any observations?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to Mike, Tim, Brian, Rick. I mean, this is exactly the type of feedback that we're looking for. I just want to reiterate to this group, and you all know, we're just getting started here. We're starting to dig into, scratch the surface, and there's a lot of information that we haven't gone through that we will have to go through. But what we're trying to generate here is more recent, more accurate information that we can convey to the public. Mike, I take your point is very well made that, having too many map products will just make it more confusing. So that's something that we need to avoid moving forward and provide a final product, whether that be like, online GIS platform resource that folks that are trying to get permits or trying to develop with, adjacent to a stream, first of all, that it's going to provide information that is going to allow them to do that more safely, but that it's not going to create a bigger burden on them to, if required, get the proper permits, but rather facilitate that by having information that's going to allow them to show here, we're not creating a flood hazard by that. So again, I just want to reiterate, these are great comments. This is exactly what we're looking for. And I'm looking forward to, the opportunity to talk with each of you, maybe separate leads, so that I can get these things noted and we can address them. That's it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. Sometimes we hear these presentations when the analysis is a bit more cooked. So it's good. Thank you, staff. Thank you, consultants, for bringing this forward at its conception and introduction, so we can begin to think about and have input early on. Good comments all around. So, Mr. Jones, do you see anyone else who might want to talk?
I do not.
Okay. So, Leslie, are we nearing the end here with this? Mr. Harvey, are we near the end?
I believe that was your only item today, Madam Vice President.
That's what I know. Just wanted to be sure. Okay. Well, we're supposed to be here till 2, but I'm happy to adjourn right now unless you all want to stay and smile and talk. All right. Well, bad news. 72 degrees here in Chico, no rain inside. So we're hoping hoping it doesn't get too hot and melt that snow fast. All right. Have a good weekend, everyone, and a very good Monday. We know what day that is. And see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jane.
Yep, thanks, Jane. Have a good weekend, everyone.
You too.